Our text today has bad news and good news. See if you can hear both of them. It's Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 18. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom and the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we await for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we are saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes in what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Well, bad news first. Our text tells us that at the center of the universe is a groan. It's not the kind of groan that you make when you're lifting weights at the gym, or the kind of groan that you hear when you're approaching a sink full of dirty dishes, or even the kind of groan that students get when they look at the final exam questions. It's a deeper groan. It's not even the groan that we involuntarily utter when we find ourselves inarticulate before some amazingly beautiful or awesome thing. We've all known that. You've known that. All of us know that there are things that we can shout easily enough. All of us know that there are some things we can only whisper, and there are things that we can hardly say at all. We draw our breath in pain to say them. They are so profoundly important that we cannot go chattering along anymore. You've known that. Perhaps it were the words that you had prepared for some occasion, a eulogy at a friend's memorial service, a toast at your daughter's wedding. And then suddenly you realize what those words really said and meant, and you became overwhelmed by your own message, and your words moved into a groan and then into silence. I didn't know about the groan in my early days of ministry. I thought I was supposed to be able to talk about any part of the Bible, anything, and to explain it to people, get it all figured out and tell them what it meant. No text was too tough. God tells Abraham to kill his son, no problem. I got it covered. But then eventually I learned that there are some things that cannot be explained. They can only be experienced. Fred Craddock is one of my very favorite Christian preachers and writers, and he has written eloquently about the groan. He recalls many years ago when he was a young professor in Oklahoma. The paper in his little town carried an article every Friday by a local Native American woman named Molly Shepard. She was an Arapaho Cheyenne, well along in years and with broken English, but beautiful and moving. She told stories about the events that happened on the reservation, about the funerals and the weddings, about the blanket parties, all kinds of things. And Fred Craddock, a professor and student of language, enjoyed the interesting way she employed the language. He sometimes cut out the articles and saved them. He said, I recall the article that she wrote on the Friday following the assassination of President John Kennedy. Her article was the briefest he had ever read, very few sentences. It read, "Molly has no article today. Molly has no words today. Molly cannot speak today. Molly goes through the house saying, oh, oh, oh." You know the groan. You heard it on 9/11 when you first saw the images of the planes crashing into the buildings and the buildings collapsing. You heard the groan every time you saw the video of George Floyd being slowly murdered in front of 4 other policemen who did nothing. The groan when you first heard the news of an unarmed Breonna Taylor being gunned down in her apartment in the middle of the night. When you saw the video of the armed white man on a Georgia street who shot Ahmaud Arbery just while he was jogging. When you read about states changing the laws to make it harder for people of color to vote. The groan of living in a society that a century and a half after the end of slavery is still so affected by systemic racism. Living in a society still affected by homophobia and transphobia, a society filled with sexism and bias against women. I don't need to tell you about the groan, Imani. You know it far better than I do. Paul says that all creation groans. So deep is the groan that you can't hear it, but you know it's there. Ever since the early chapters of Genesis, when the stories were told to describe how things somehow went terribly wrong with human beings. Thorns and thistles cursed is the ground for your sake. And so it all began, the futility and the frustration and the conflict and the hurt. Oh, it doesn't show up all the time. Sometimes creation is gentle and quiet and comfortable. In the spring of the year, when the meadows are turning somersaults of joy and the world is a poem of light and color, you think, well, where is the frustration and the decay? Where is all those things? But we know that it's still there. Paul says that we groan too. The children of God groan. We're all a part of creation. We're brothers and sisters. And all of that comes storming through. We groan too, vulnerable. And this past year and a half, the entire world has been groaning because of a little microbe so small that it can only be seen through a microscope. And that is called all of creation to groan. Walter Rauschenbusch was a professor in the early part of the last century. He was one of the founders of the movement which is called the social gospel. And these people believed that following Jesus meant that you must be deeply engaged in trying to solve the problems of the world. Now, that may sound obvious to you. I mean, the whole motto of Imani Church is faith to change the world, right? But back in those days, it wasn't obvious to all Christians. There were a bunch of people who thought that the only purpose of Christianity was personal salvation, was getting my soul to heaven. That's all that really mattered. That's all that counted. I want to get out of here and get to a good place as fast as I can, and I don't need to be engaged in helping the world to be a better place. But Rauschenbusch, who taught at a seminary in Rochester, New York, he was deeply involved in working for a bond issue that would bring sewer lines and fresh water and sanitation to a large poor section of the city. And the bond issue came before the voters. And the next morning, Dr. Rauschenbusch came into his class. He had the newspaper under his arm. He opened it up and he held it up to the class and it said, bond issue defeated. And he put his head down on his desk, and his shoulders shook, and he cried. And that day, the class, they heard the groan. So what is the good news? The fact that there is a groan at the center of reality is not necessarily a bad thing. The closer you live to that center, the more you will hear it, and you will share in the reality of it. But our text has two wonderful things that I want you to remember this day as you're dealing with this experience of interacting with this deep groan in the world. First, it says that when words fail you and you don't know how to pray, when you're so confused and depressed and you feel like your words, your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling of your room, when prayer seems totally futile, it says the Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And God knows what is the mind of the Spirit. God finds the words for you and expresses them in words. He says, I get where you're at. I know your pain. I know your needs. So when you feel like you are failing in your prayers, when nothing seems right, God steps in and finishes your prayers for you. In other words, your prayers can never fail because God is there to complete them. The second part of the passage says that the groan will not last forever. Paul says the groan is not the groan of death. It's not a groan that lasts forever. It is the groan of childbirth. It's not the groan of something that is dying and going away. It's the groan of something new that is coming forth, something that is beginning. You know, in a hospital, the happiest ward is the maternity ward, right? Because that's the only one that's all about the future. The other ones are tough. But the maternity ward, the groans are happy. They're all about new life coming into the world. And Paul says that the groan that we hear at the center of creation is about new birth. He said God is going to bring about a new kingdom. The book of Revelation says he will wipe away all tears from our eyes. Behold, I am making all things new. It's our job, by the way, to be a part of that new creation, but that's a separate sermon. But we do have this encouraging note at the end of our text. Your prayers can never fail. God understands even when you don't have the right words. And so, just about the time that we have mastered the groan, we're going to have to learn how to exchange it for wow. Amen.